At the start of 2026, we were given one of the best animated episodes of the year and probably the decade as a whole, with Maki slaughtering the entire Zenin clan, which gave us a glimpse of the full capabilities of Naoya, at least within the confines of him as a human. With Naoya getting absolutely slaughtered by Maki when she finally achieved her physical awakening, gaining a body of steel. It made me wonder how Naoya would fare against a similar type of character, which brings us to Mitsuri, who is essentially Demon Slayer's equivalent to a heavenly restricted female. Having the strength to pick up big rocks as a 13-month-old baby, beat sumo wrestlers and arm wrestles as a toddler, all coupled with her extremely proficient breathing mastery, which can allow her to tangle with some of the strongest beings within her own series. As this is the first Demon Slayer vs Jujutsu Kaisen video on my channel, I'd appreciate it if you guys could remain open-minded to this discussion, as if you do, I'm sure you'll walk away learning at least something from this video. I will be mainly going over the manga scaling for these two series, rather than the anime, since the anime tends to greatly exaggerate the feats performed on screen, but if needed, I'll potentially include some arguments if it brings anything interesting to the discussion. But with that all being covered, like and subscribe to this channel to see more of this type of content, and let's just get into finding out who would come out on top between the misogynistic era of the Zenin clan or the Love Hashira. The first thing that I think needs to be addressed, since some people have this preconception in their mind, is the idea that Demon Slayers and the entire verse as a whole are capped within the confines of superhuman physical stats, with pretty sword effects that just simply aren't real. One of these things is true, however, the sword effects that the Slayers produce aren't real. For example, Giyu doesn't literally spawn in an ocean or line of water whenever he uses water breathing. But aside from this notion, there isn't really anything to support this line of thinking, aside from just being misinformed on how the power system or total concentration breathing works. The very brief Cliff Notes version of how it works is that Demon Slayers can essentially raise their body's blood flow and heart rate to increase your temperature and make yourself strong like a demon. We just have this stated within the series on multiple occasions, which is why we have blatant feats that demonstrate durability, speed, and strength vastly above the likes of a peak human in our world. Like Rengoku being able to make a train hop above the tracks by beginning a sprint, Tengen being able to cut multiple explosives before they detonate, Giyu being sent through multiple buildings, Tanjiro and Muichiro surviving similar attacks while also surviving falls from a considerable distance from the ground with little to no damage. You get the point, it's just incredibly dishonest to cap the verse by this metric when there's little to no reason for it. If you think that it doesn't make sense for breathing to vastly increase a person's strength to this great of a degree, that's because that's just simply true. I can't jump up the size of a house no matter how good I am at breathing, but that doesn't take away from the feats performed. This is fiction. You can make anything possible in the confines of a fictional manga. This is the same verse that lets you stare at someone's muscles and bone structure by concentrating hard enough. Our MC can smell people's power levels and emotions. You can survive being cut in half, etc., etc. Demon Slayer is a more grounded and relative to other shonen manga a pretty weak verse, but they still perform feats that can be discussed within a video like this, making a discussion like this possible and even interesting as a result. So now we can just get into the actual scaling that these two have to offer. To start out with Naoya Zenin's strength and attack potency scaling, at least in regard to the content covered up to Season 3, scaling his power prior to fully stacking his speed can get a little bit tricky. The anime did make Naoya look pretty bad, with him landing tens to potentially hundreds of blows on Choso, and them not doing any notable damage, which is still kind of true in the manga, but they do reduce the amount of blows Naoya deals to Choso prior to Choso locking in and taking over the fight with flowing red scale stack. This isn't a very good look for Naoya's attack potency, since we see that beginning of Shibuya Yuji is able to deal notable damage to Choso with just 3 unguarded hits, with 2 of them occurring when Choso is amplifying his physical stats with flowing red scale. Meanwhile, Naoya is unable to replicate anywhere near the same damage with a lot more unguarded blows on a base Choso. This would cap Naoya's regular attack potency below early Shibuya Yuji, who shouldn't be massively stronger than his Goodwill self due to the events of Shibuya and the Goodwill event not being too far apart in time, and Yuji not displaying or being implied to have any meaningful change in power. And this version of Yuji is barely able to damage Hanami with his baseline punches and kicks. We can then establish that Naoya should at the bare minimum scale to city block to multi-city block level through scaling above characters like early Mecha Maru, who can create city block level explosions which can be tanked by base Panda, both of which scaling back to Naoya since he's of significantly higher rank and can do at least some damage to Choso. We can get him just a bit higher if we scale him to 40% Mahito's casual tremors in Shibuya, which is calced at multi-city block level, which is a bit of a stretch to say Naoya can reach these levels normally, but for the sake of the video, let's grant it. This in itself isn't very impressive, but this is decently far from his highest assertions you can give him when he starts to accelerate and stack his technique and build up momentum, which allows him to do some amount of damage to Maki, and if we use the anime, he's able to destroy decently sized mountains by running, which is calced to be small town level in the anime. However, I'd like to focus on the fact that he's able to somewhat damage Maki with his flurry of attacks. This is really impressive considering the fact that Maki doesn't seem to get physically stronger or more durable after this point, with her being stated in an interview with Gege to be Toji's physical equal, and by people like Ranta to have become just like Toji. The only thing Maki seemingly gains after this point is more awareness or understanding of her heavenly restriction, gaining the ability to take advantage of the scattered surfaces of the sky and use them to air step and predict her opponent's attacks. This is all important because Maki has some pretty good durability scaling. With her scaling to the other heavy hitters via feats and narrative, she's scaled to people like Yuta who can tank baseline granite blasts from Ryu, which are calced at small town level. She'd scale well above base Mahito who can tank Mekamaru's 1-year charge, which depending on the calc ranges from low-end town level to high-end town level, all the way up to large town level with her tanking Urame's max output Frost Calm, which we can reason scales above her other ice structures, which includes the ice structure she created in chapter 237, which was calced at large town level in attack potency. However, due to the fact that Naoya only really does minor damage to Maki with multiple direct hits, with the narrator more so implying Maki's at a disadvantage due to her already being critically injured, he would scale on the lower percentage of Maki's durability, which by the fact that his own feats only get him to around small town to low end town level in attack potency, it makes everything I'm saying very consistent. So to conclude the attack potency section for Naoya, he should have city block to multi-city block attack potency while casual and not accelerating, and small town to town level attack potency while accelerating. All of these values would mostly scale back to his durability due to Newton's third law, which would mean Naoya would have to endure the force of his own attacks. Some people would probably downplay Naoya by saying Maki one-shotted him, which means he wouldn't scale at all to her attack potency or even his own attack potency. However, this isn't really a debunk since Naoya is literally running directly into Maki's fist, which would cause more harm than if Maki punched him normally. So with that being said, we can move on to the attack potency of Mitsuri. Mitsuri and Demon Slayer's attack potency in general is a lot more simple to argue and understand compared to Jujutsu Kaisen's, since the bare minimum scaling that almost every high tier should scale to is performed by the weakest upper moon in the series. This is obviously Gyutaro's destruction of the Red Light District. Firstly, I'm gonna just establish that this attack does likely scale, at least mostly to Gyutaro's neck durability. This is because everything within a demon's arsenal is powered by their blood, and a demon's neck typically has a higher concentration of blood compared to their attacks, since that's their vital spot and only way to be killed. We have examples of this like when Rui states that his neck is more durable than the max he can amplify his own attacks, and Tanjiro outright stating that if he can't cut Akaza's arm, he'll have no shot at cutting his neck, which is consistent for basically every demon we see that their neck is more tough and potent than the rest of their bodies. Not only that, but we have multiple instances within the series that when a demon is beheaded, their body becomes more fragile and their attacks become weaker. We see this when Akaza is beheaded and he's getting evaded by a weakened Tanjiro, and Giyu is explicitly surprised that Akaza can move that fast while beheaded, and we have more explicit statements from Gyome that Kokushibo's body should be fragile since he got beheaded, which not only implies this is a general rule for most demons, but we also see this when Gyome can easily behead Kokushibo when before he couldn't put a dent in his neck. So not only should a demon's neck scale higher than their maximum output, but Gyutaro's body was fragile and weakened when he launched his final attack due to being beheaded. This is all a really long way of saying that anyone who can cut Gyutaro's head should scale to the potency of the final attack he used. I know that may seem weird since Gyutaro's other attacks are way less destructive than his main one, but you can easily explain it away with his other attacks being more concentrated and less focused on massive destruction. If you want examples of what I mean, think about how Cell's dormant energy is able to destroy the Earth, at least, but when he's fighting the Z fighters in his perfect state, his attacks, while logically more potent, aren't causing that level of destruction due to being concentrated. With that all being said, this would scale back to Entertainment District Dark Tanjiro with his mark to low-end town level via being able to behead Gyutaro and his final explosion being calced to that level, which Mitsuri, even in her base form, should massively upscale from. I would actually say that you can quantify how much stronger Mitsuri is than this attack by taking into account the amp she got from the Demon Slayer mark. To put it into perspective, the amp from the mark, based on performance differences and the narrative relevance it has, should be at the very least a 2x amp to a Slayer's speed and power. With that in mind, base Tanjiro in the Swordsmith Village arc is stated by Han Tengu to have exceeded the information Muzan told them about, which I did mention in the previous video, included his mark, and then Tanjiro is able to stack his mark onto, which would be a 2x increase. And then he gets outperformed by base Mitsuri, and then she also gains a 2x increase to her overall power with her own mark. This would get Mitsuri, depending on the Gyutaro calc, anywhere from 24 kilotons, which is town level, to nearing large town levels of power. Her durability wouldn't scale 1-to-1 with her attack potency, but we can scale her to the fatigued version of Obanai and Tanjiro, who could survive a portion of weakened Muzan's town level shockwave, which was calced at 8 kilotons. This shockwave was able to reach the Ubuyashiki hideout, which is due to the power and range of this attack, and not some hacks via damaging the crows and the paper tags. Seeing as how multiple crows and paper tags were destroyed prior, but none had this effect on Ubuyashiki's children, and the fanbook explicitly notes that it's due to the range of this attack, we can say that it's AP based and not some hacks. Furthermore, since Tanjiro and Obanai were near the epicenter of the blast and tanked a portion of the attack, we can say these two, and by proxy Mitsuri, have small town to low-end town level durability. With Naoya being less known for his striking power and more so his overwhelming speed with his technique, it does bring up the question of where does Naoya scale in speed within the manga. We can safely give him the lowball of subsonic speeds via his evasions of piercing blood, which is calced at subsonic, coupled with multiple other bullet dodging feats performed by people like Geto. Sorry Maki, but Gege said your feat was a bit too much, so I won't be including that here. And saying that he surpasses subsonic or Mach 1 speeds when going all out via statements from Maki and the narrator. However, for the sake of argument, let's pretend that these statements don't exist. Where would he scale then? We can comfortably scale his base speed a perception blitz higher than Shibuya Yuji, who can at least somewhat react to piercing blood at a transonic to supersonic level degree, and then say that since a perception blitz gap is at least 6 times, Naoya's base speed would be in those hypersonic plus tiers. This can be considered consistent with him being able to swap hands with an admittedly weakened Maki, who should scale to the top tiers like Yuta and Kenjaku, the latter having a calc getting in those hypersonic plus tiers via his own dodging of piercing blood. However, with his top speed, it's implied that even while healthy, Maki prior to becoming fully realized still needs to prepare in order to react to human Naoya's top speed, which can scale Naoya to a feat like Toji dodging Megami's stab after Megami already pierced his clothing, which can be calced from as low as Mach 90 all the way up to Mach 200 plus, which is massively hypersonic. This is about where Naoya's speed scaling ends for me. I don't particularly buy into feats like Akari dodging lightning, since due to the angle, it's possible the lightning was always aimed at his shoulder, with Akari's newfound stance being a result of him being flung to the side from the explosion, which would be consistent with him not dodging the lightning the second time while playing more defensive out of fear of said lightning bolt. This would get Naoya at a low ball of subsonic to transonic speeds with statements, with the mid ball ignoring statements getting to hypersonic plus, and his high ball being high hypersonic plus to massively hypersonic. As for Mitsuri, she should scale to those tens of times faster than sound speed ranges via Tanjiro in Season 1 reacting to Kyogai's drum slashes, which are stated in the fanbook, manga, and anime to be the speed of sound, and Tanjiro can dodge these while injured in his ribs, off guard while fighting Inosuke, and carrying a little girl. You then just stack the 6 times perception blitz multiplier at a bare minimum, with Daki perception blitzing a stronger Tanjiro in Season 2, Tengen perception blitzing this same Daki, and Mitsuri being stated relative to Tengen in base, and then she just gets a 2 times amp with her Demon Slayer mark, getting her to around 40 to 70 times faster than sound. You can get her massively higher if you have any level of charitability via Daki reacting to explosives while they're actively detonating, which is Mach 200, or Tengen slicing multiple explosives before any of them detonate, which is Mach 1700. Or, if you want to be a little bit controversial, argue her own lightning dodging feats, which can scale all the way up to Mach 2000 in her base form. The immediate reaction someone will say is that these lightning bolts or Demon Slayer as a whole can't be this fast, since Genya blitzed the Hantengu clones with his shotgun, Muzan getting supposedly blitzed by a house explosive, or Mitsuri getting tagged by sound waves. For the first two examples, they just lack a lot of context. Not only are the weaponry and explosives in this verse powered by special gunpowder specifically made to harm demons, but it's stated directly by Tanjiro that the clones were letting themselves be hit to grow stronger and split up, which is supported later when Sekido reacts to Genya's bullet. As for the Muzan example, it's just an example of an off-guard feat. Not only does Muzan explicitly state he didn't expect an attack of this level, but he also just implies he let his guard down to begin with, which can be tied to Muzan being a cocky character in general. The common rebuttal to this is that Muzan shouldn't be off guard if he really is this fast. To that, I just have to ask, do you know what medium or genre we're reading or watching? This type of stuff happens all the time, like in Dragon Ball where Goku is able to be scratched by a bullet despite trying to block. Are we now going to cap Goku at like supersonic reaction speeds, since logically if he was massively faster than light he would have been able to reinforce himself properly? Are we going to say Omni-Man is like supersonic or like barely hypersonic because he got blitzed by a house explosive like Muzan did? Obviously not. This type of stuff happens in fiction all the time. It's clearly just either an oversight or again an instance of a character being off guard and not contradicting any of the prior scaling made before. As for Mitsuri, the only thing I'd really need to ask is, prove that these sound waves are operating at Mach 1? We have reason to believe they're not, since Tanjiro was struggling to avoid them when previously in a much weaker state 2 seasons back, he was dodging stated sound speed attacks. And if we said these attacks were capable of blitzing Mitsuri, by the logic presented prior, it would stand to reason that they'd have to be above Mach 1. With that being covered, this would get Mitsuri at a fat lowball at high hypersonic to high hypersonic plus, with her more realistic ends being at about massively hypersonic to massively hypersonic plus even in just her base form. But with that all being covered, let's just get into how this matchup would play out. When discussing a matchup like this, there's a couple things you have to question going into this. Number 1, can Naoya make physical contact with Mitsuri to take advantage of his technique's ability to stun his opponent for a second in a projection sorcery frame? Number 2, does Naoya have a way of hitting Mitsuri to begin with? And number 3, if both of these things are a no, does Naoya have the durability and endurance to survive Mitsuri's onslaught? And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but all of these things are massively in Mitsuri's favor. When looking at their attack potency and durability, it becomes pretty clear that even without taking into account any multipliers, Mitsuri in her base form should be within Naoya's tier of power and durability, with Gyutaro on a low end getting results higher than Naoya's own calcs, with the scaling being higher than anything you can reasonably assert through scaling him to Maki. This is all not talking about the fact that Mitsuri should scale several times higher than this attack, which would just widen the gap even further than it already was. The speed difference also doesn't make things any better, if anything it just furthers the beatdown. Naoya, when taking into account statements, is tens of times slower than Mitsuri even at his top speed while lowballing Mitsuri. And when using calcs, he really doesn't have anything to get him in Mitsuri's tier of speed without purposely highballing Jujutsu Kaisen speed and taking the lowest possible end for Mitsuri, which would still be tens of times faster than sound. However, if you do have even the slightest bit of charitability for Demon Slayer, then Mitsuri should be in those hundreds of thousands of times faster than sound at a reasonable scale, even for her base form, with the consistency of other calcs, with nothing really contradicting this. The way I would see this fight going if it happened in real time would be Naoya telling Mitsuri to go do the dishes and mop the floor, and Mitsuri either decapitating or doing lethal damage before Naoya even knows what happened. The fight isn't close on any front, Mitsuri wins very handedly. However, let's give Naoya a second chance from beyond the grave. Does anything change when we remove Naoya's limitations as a human and give him a vastly better arsenal and the biology of a curse? For this bonus round, I'll be applying verse equalization, meaning that Mitsuri can at least imbue her sword with cursed energy so she can damage curses without it amplifying her AP to too much of a degree, and she'll have cursed energy so things in Naoya's arsenal can work on her. With that out of the way, when it comes to Cursed Spirit Naoya, his overall scaling and arsenal goes up dramatically. He obviously gains access to the insane regeneration and endurance of a special grade Cursed Spirit, but he also gets a plethora of extra scaling which we can use to make this matchup go very differently. While his speed scaling doesn't really change much due to him just having a stated Mach 3 low end, and then we would just upscale off of the previous speed scaling we gave human Naoya, his power, hacks, and durability take a massive leap. We see that when charging up his speed, Naoya is able to do significant internal damage to Maki to the point that she needs to leave the fight and heal up. This is similar to what a weakened Sukuna was able to do to her with a Black Flash, which also put her out of commission for a bit of time. Albeit the period is a bit less quantifiable compared to Maki having to take 5 minutes to heal Naoya's attack. Nonetheless, it would mean he scales more proportionally to Urame's Ice Calcs, which would get Naoya in the large town ranges, albeit not scaling fully to this attack since Urame did explicitly spread out the power of this attack to both her and Yuji, but Maki did take more of this attack so it's fine to use for her. This means Mitsuri is going to have a much harder time killing him due to this increased durability and regeneration. However, Mitsuri isn't necessarily out of options either, since we see that Naoya isn't always this durable, and according to Naoya, doesn't compare to Hanami in durability without curling up to the point where he's able to actually damage Naoya. So it's safe to reason that outside of Naoya's external shell, Mitsuri will be able to damage him at least for some amount of time. But this all becomes pretty much futile when Naoya opens his domain expansion. If you need a reminder, Naoya's domain sure hit targets your individual cells, and due to his technique means that if you don't move your cells in accordance to how Naoya is moving his cells, you can cause damage to yourself, and depending on the action you can outright lose limbs. This is something Mitsuri has no counter to. Not only can she not see Naoya's cells or control her own cells for obvious reasons, but it also means she's gonna have to kill Naoya very quickly before she ends up killing herself in the process by simply moving. Which is something I see as being very unlikely due to Naoya's durability outscaling her attack potency, but even if she does do some damage, Naoya can just regenerate since he's a cursed spirit. Mitsuri will likely be able to dish out some attacks since characters vastly slower than her like Dido can move a decent distance and swing his sword before he loses his arm, but I find it highly unlikely that Mitsuri will be able to kill Naoya before his Shurit completely kills her. Meaning that Naoya, when removed from the confines of his humanity, defeats Demon Slayer's heavenly restricted female most times out of 10.